In this video, I'm just going to introduce very briefly the concept of validation and consider how it might apply in our Spring Boot applications. As I'm sure you're aware, data validation is making sure that the quality of the data that we use is fit for purpose in our applications. We can get invalid data from all kinds of places. User input is a very frequent source of invalid data. The user will accidentally input the wrong kind of values. Or if they do it deliberately, we might call it hacking. And indeed, invalid data can come from all kinds of other places. And so our programs need to check the data, and this is called validation. And it will include verification of data type and data values judged against business rules. And of course, it should go without saying, using invalid data is not acceptable. And therefore, when we detect invalid data, we need to reject it. In our Spring Boot applications, we have many components in which we might want to do some validation. In the REST controller, for example, when we receive an HTTP request, we would want to validate the data that we have received. It could be argued that whenever any of these components receives data, we would want to validate it. But that seems to be rather a lot of validation. For example, when some data is received via an HTTP request and we validate it and then pass it on to the service and the service validates it and then passes it on to the repository and the repository validates it, and when we get some data from the database and the entity validates that data and then the service builds a DTO and the DTO validates the data that's put into it, that might be considered a bit of overkill, just too much validation. And so I think you should use your judgment and develop your validation software according to what you think is appropriate. I would suggest that at the very least, any data arriving from outside of the application should be validated. Therefore, when you receive data from an HTTP request, that has come from outside of the application and therefore should be validated. Having validated the data and you pass it on to the service, there's probably no need to validate it again because you've already done the validation prior to passing it on to the service. And likewise with a repository. On the other hand, it could be argued that before the application sends data out of the application, in this case towards a database, it might be well to validate that data again. When we receive data from the database, well, again, that's outside of the application coming into the Spring Boot application. Therefore, it might be considered that validation is appropriate at that point. And again, as the REST controller is about to return some data to the client, maybe that data should be validated again at that point. But I think as a minimum, the REST controller must always validate the data that it receives. Now, there are different types of data validation, and I would recommend that you do some additional reading on the subject.